And I have decided to discuss George Washington for my final video presentation for the semester. So obviously, we all know who Washington is and how he is located on the quarter. But I'm going to go into depth about Washington during the American Revolution and his time as president and how he leads his people not only as a soldier but as a president. So I know I have said this before in my previous videos, but just to reiterate myself, I think it's crazy how much we learn as a child comparing it to when we learn it as an adult. The knowledge that we learn when we're a young adult is an interesting thing. I mean, when I was a kid, I never really understood how Washington was as a person or how he portrayed himself. But learning in this course, he was a natural born leader that had these tendencies about him. He wasn't the most academically inclined person, but he was great he wasn't great at military strategy, but he definitely knew how to communicate to the people to lead them to greatness. So for some background information about Washington, just to refresh our memories from what we learned in elementary school, he was born February 22nd, 1732, in the British colony of Virginia. So before the American Revolution, looking into his young adult life, Washington actually had previous commander involvement during the French and Indian War, eventually putting him during this time. This involvement eventually put him in charge of Virginia's militia forces, like we learned in previous chapters. But like I said, I'm going to go into further detail about his time being commander-in-chief of the Continental Army during the Revolution, and then his time as president. So, Washington was commander-in-chief after his first time fighting during the Revolution. He was commander-in-chief, and then after this time fighting in the Revolution, he was elected as the first president in 1789 and served 2 terms. Washington decided to get involved in the American Revolution because he had a first-hand experience from the effects of high taxes that were imposed on the colonists from Britain, and he wanted to take action. It was during this time that he believed it was time for America to gain independence from England, and he found during his time as a delegate in the First Continental Congress that he would later become commander-in-chief in the Army in the Second Continental Congress a year later. While he was commander-in-chief, Washington had high expectations for his soldiers. Washington himself had a strong moral code that had an unshakable faith that was shown in his character. George Washington expected the soldiers to become Christian and defend their country's rights and liberties with faith and patriotism. He created moral boundaries for the army that had required officers and soldiers to go to church and be a gentleman. So this required no heavy drinking or cursing, but he didn't force anybody to pray. But he wanted to make sure that they had respect in this sense. Washington set the example for his men by living his rules, not only as a military leader, but as a political one as well. So he displayed that he genuinely wanted the best for his people. So while he instilled these expectations, he was able to give the men direction and motivation to keep fighting for their country's freedom. And although they were poorly trained over the 8 years, the colonial forces were able to hold their own against the British and eventually capture the British troops under General Charles Cornwallis in Yorktown, Virginia, ending the Revolutionary War and making Washington a war hero. So after the Revolutionary War had ended, he was elected the first president of the United States. Washington was called the man that unites all hearts, that was a Southern gentleman, and was above moral reproach. Washington was a quiet man that had a strong moral code, that had this unshakable faith, like I said earlier, that made his character a great candidate for being a leader. So men saw Washington as a leader that personified freedom in the United States. And although he had great morals, his presidency brought some controversy and a fight for more freedom. He was extremely popular in the beginning of his terms as president, but along the way towards the end, he ends up losing some popularity because some believed that his views didn't match up with the revolution. Since Washington was better at discussion and compromising, he was not good at strategy. He needed help from men that were able to write for him in public. So during his presidency, he had men like Alexander Hamilton that served as his aide during his time in office. He was also his Secretary of Treasury. Washington also had Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, Henry Knox as Secretary of War, Edmund Randolph as Secretary of War, So Washington believed that America should have exploration and expansion to dominate in the American continent. So in order for this to happen, Washington insisted to his cabinet that there needed to be neutrality in war between Britain and France to commit America as an impartial witness to Europe. And this would give America time to grow when conflict is happening. So he believed God has given a great continent to America that will liberate them from petty disputes in the real world, which eventually leads to the Jay Treaty in 1795. So this is where a lot of controversy comes from his presidency and actually leads to some protests as well. The treaty promises Britain most favored trade status in exchange for recognizing American neutrality in the war. Washington believed it maintained national interest for America by not dragging the nation into war, but it says Britain has a favored trade status with America. Many people, for example, like Jefferson in his own cabinet, were so aggravated by this treaty. And Jefferson mainly felt aggravated because he felt as though he was being undercut from his position. And the public was outraged by it because they created the treaty protest throughout the year of 1796 and eventually called for Washington to ratify this treaty. I would say, like I said, losing interest. This is where he lost a lot of the popularity, not only from the public people, but from the members of his cabinet as well. And a lot of people lost trust in him. So instead of running again for a third term in office, he decided to step down from leadership to let the democratic process run its course. He wanted to give people a chance to choose. So he had his memorable farewell address that included his hopes for America and what he urges Americans to do. And two big things that he wanted from this ultimately was that he wanted nothing but high standards domestically and lower foreign powers involvement to keep the neutrality. So he wanted to limit the foreign powers that America had. I believe I believe Washington was and continues to be a very influential man in America. I mean, we still remember him, right? He was a natural-born leader that was a war hero and a great compromiser. It's nice to learn about his character as an adult to get a better understanding of his life and why he made the certain decisions that he did. He made mistakes that upset men in his cabinet, like Jefferson, but ultimately he was a humble man that, in my case, I believe he wanted the best for his people and his country. It is also controversial that after his retirement of president and stepping down from the position, he moved to his property, Mount Vernon, and he actually owned around 300 slaves. And which, again, during this time, it was controversial of who was against it and who wasn't. But before his death, he actually had become opposed to slavery and demanded that they would be freed once his wife passed away. In my own opinion, I believe Washington made a better commander-in-chief than he did president, just by looking at his comfort level. He was confident leading his men in battle and keeping them motivated through speeches to remind them what they were fighting for. But once Washington tried to make decisions based on ideas. He was based on like the ideas as a president. He wasn't very good at writing and looking at problems from all angles. He kind of just saw an idea like neutrality and decided to go for it. Washington, during his presidency, Washington didn't communicate to his cabinet very well about his thoughts and opinions, which probably would have helped him compromise better with them instead of ruining relationships. Jefferson believed, and again, Jefferson was so aggravated that he believed that Washington actually ruined ties and hurt relationships just in time for him to step out of office and leave the blame to the next president and one of Jefferson's good friends, John Adams, which we learned this week was a whole mess. So I hope you guys enjoyed my video. It's been a very interesting class that actually helped me get a better understanding of history and relearning it. Yeah, like I said, like an updated understanding of our country and how it became what it is today. I would have to say my favorite part of the class was definitely learning about our founding fathers and the struggles that they overcame to fight for our independence. It was nice to relearn about Washington's character as a commander-in-chief and how he lived his life respectfully, following what he believed in his faith. He was strong in his faith. He truly was a man of greatness that motivated his people to keep fighting for their country's independence. Thank you.